Hello, my name is Jane Hall. I'm a founding member of the architecture collective Assemble, based in London. But I'm also the author of Breaking Ground, Architecture by Women, published by Phaidon last year. This probably looks backwards to you all, but it's really good the right way around. I'm going to talk a little bit about this book and about some of the women architects featured in it, but also their buildings. So I'm just going to share my screen. So you can see a presentation. Okay. So thank you all for coming, and thank you for the Polish Cultural Institute in London for hosting this particular talk. So 2 years ago, Phaidon approached us to research the architecture of women architects, and this is really presented as a kind of visual survey in Breaking Ground through lots of kind of big, colourful images. I'm going to begin by introducing the book, describing the kind of broader structure of it and the editorial lens that produced it, whilst kind of pausing here and there to talk about in a bit more detail some of the work of the women architects who are featured in its pages. So as I said, it's a visual survey, so you can kind of see, and the scope was great works of architecture, so quite a subjective lens to begin with, and it captures work by women architects from 1900 to the present day. But for us, the book is just, the kind of simply the final product of what is in fact a much larger piece of research, as you can kind of see here from the spreadsheet where we kind of kept track of all of our findings. So during this talk, I will mention a number of the kind of 150 people who are in Breaking Ground, but I'll speak about those from this kind of larger long list who are not included. At first, I was quite hesitant about authoring this book. The question of gender, particularly one that is often contested, appears really to kind of risk the homogenization and in fact simplification of the experience of women and their working lives. This is the argument that Danish architect Dorte Mandrup makes when she asserts that I'm not a female architect, I am an architect. And what Mandrup is really doing is positing that few other professions require their workers to define in such a way. And as such, when forced to do so, because, like, after all, why would you unless coerced, the credibility of female architects is undermined, relegated inadvertently to second-class citizens. Acclaimed Pakistani architect Yasmin Lowry, on the other hand, offers us a kind of slightly different lens through which to understand the same position. She does not feel the term women architect fits her own sense of self-identity, not because it somehow undermines the position of women within the profession, but that in general terms being labelled as a woman in Pakistan is indelibly linked with class difference. And so the professional title of architect transcends gender in socio-political terms. What really unites Yasmin Lowry and Dorte Mandrup's positions, despite the disparity in location that has produced them, is that they're really quite specific to a middle class experience, one that sees a continuing sense of disidentification of architects from their gender. So what is behind this? Being aware of gender is broadly considered valuable. That's kind of why we're here and interested in this kind of talk, but yet increasingly seems anachronistic and irrelevant to the present way in which a growing number of women perceive their own experience in work. And this can shift depending on sort of cultural resources drawn on to discuss feminist politics in architecture. So, not all of us are able to negotiate structural constraints autonomously, like Mandrup and Lowry. Yet through our research, it felt increasingly necessary and urgent even that women architects identify as such. And as you can see here are a number of Assemble women at the London Women's March in January 2017, kind of professing that position. And, it's really to say that not only do we exist, but we have contributed significantly to the built environment, their profession, and received architectural history, despite remaining essentially invisible in the form in which it is currently told. This has been evident in a number of different ways over time, many of them in fact very high profile. For example, in 1999, The Pritzker Prize failed to award Denise Scott Brown the prize in recognition of her work alongside partner Robert Venturi. And this has only been echoed years later by the invisibility of Liu Wenyu from her partner Wang Shu's 2012 success. These, if you've heard of these architects, then you should definitely look them up. These are really suspicious omissions. Both are women who have supposedly made it in a man's world, yet their right to occupy such space remains constantly subject to revision. Amateur Architecture Studio was founded by both Wang Shu and Liu Wenyu in 1997. And the name of the practice is really a reflection of the couple's interest in the rich tradition in China of vernacular architecture built by anonymous craftsmen. After the Pritzker, the LA Times described Amateur Architecture Studio's work as having a muscular, formal language with an emphasis on craftsmanship and regional character. And they were really focusing on the practice's interest in collaboration. But when they asked Wang Shu if Liu Wenyu should have shared the prize with him, he is reported as saying, "Yes, every time when I finish the first sketch of a building, she's the first one to see it. And if she doesn't like it, I go back and draw it again." So it's really hard to reconcile the desire for professional anonymity with what is expressed on this stage as a real lack of recognition, given that global prize giving provides the opportunity to publicly celebrate collaboration, which amateur architecture suggesting is a priority for them in their name. Regardless, Liu Wenyu has commented that she does not want the fame of the Pritzker, and this really resonates with British architect Patty Hopkins' own statement, supporting the editing of a photo from a BBC documentary, which showed her absent from a lineup of famed male colleagues. You can see she's flanked by Norman Foster and Richard Rogers, kind of heavyweights of high tech. But yet this is the final image that went out. It disappears. Liu Wenyu and Patty Hopkins, however, are included in Breaking Ground without their partners. And so what their inclusion emphasizes is that each woman's experience and how they want to frame their own practice in relation to their own gender is different. And it may be subject to continual change, whether we as readers demand they take a position on it or not. So this talk provides an opportunity to go beyond the book and begin to think through how a global notion of architectural practice can account for race, class, age, sexuality, and personal politics, all shaped by geography, but rarely considered alongside gender in a mainstream publication. And those are kind of few examples of the sheer sort of breadth that is covered in Breaking Ground. We approach the work of this book largely as architectural historians, interested in challenging the real, 20th century modernist narrative in which it became the dominant, if not global, architectural style. And so this research really began at home, framed within a British context. So I'm going to begin by showing some buildings by women architects from the UK. Historian Dr. Lynn Walker argues that the two most important strands of 20th century architecture in Britain were the modern movement, but also the entry of women into the architectural profession. And so it's really this confluence that produced the pioneering factory office in Derby in 1931, designed by Nora Ayton and Betty Scott. But more significantly, perhaps, the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre at Stratford upon Avon, which was the first cultural building in the UK designed by a woman, Elizabeth Scott. Elizabeth Scott was the great niece of architect George Gilbert Scott, and in 1927 she beat 71 other entries of her design for the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre. The theatre was received with mixed reviews. It was commended by the judges for a largeness and simpleness of handling, which no other design possesses. The general silhouette and modelling to fit the lines of the river are picturesque, and the character of the design shows consideration for the locality. However, Sir Edward Elgar, then 75, who was to take over as musical director, was supposedly so furious that he refused to even enter it, citing that awful female and her unspeakably ugly and wrong design. While Scott was, one of only a few women practicing as an architect in the UK at the time, her win was significant in that she used it to employ other women as architects, who themselves went on to contribute great works. Judith Ledbetter, for example, not only assisted Elizabeth Scott in the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre, but designed the well-known Lansbury estate in Poplar, East London, as part of the Festival of Britain in 1951. As such, Breaking Ground could easily have become a book of global firsts, of which women were really at the forefront. Eleanor Agnes Raymond designed one of the first international style houses in the United States in 1931, exploring the use of innovative materials and building systems. Margaret Kropholler, who is featured in Breaking Ground, was the first female architect in the Netherlands. Angela Sabasa-Nesek was the first female architect in Serbia. She was also the first architect of any gender to hold the position of Belgrade's chief architect. Mary Rockwell Hook was the first architect in Kansas to use in situ concrete, whilst Flora Steger Crawford was the first to build a modernist house in Switzerland, known as the San Druta House in 1924. Beverly Lorraine Green was the first African-American female architect licensed in the United States in 1942. And she went on to work on the UNESCO headquarters, shown here, alongside Marcel Breuer and Pierluigi Nervi in 1950. What is extraordinary is that so many of these early pioneers were at the centre of internationally significant designs. This is in part because of the comparatively large number of building opportunities resulting from 2 world wars, which makes this architecture quietly revolutionary and part of a modernising era where women's entry into the profession in the UK and elsewhere went on to kind of parallel the wider women's liberation movement. Yet in a way, this particular history has predominantly been historicised. That means that a lot of the women architects we repeatedly hear about today, and whom you are maybe more familiar with, tend to be the ones associated with white, famed, and ubiquitously male modernists, such as Ray Eames, Alison Smithson, Jane Drew, Charlotte Perriand, Eileen Gray, and Anji Ting. And so this history, the history we have about women in architecture, remains comfortably within the retelling of Western traditions. I'm going to talk a little bit more about Anji Ting. She's a sort of personal favourite who we were unable to feature in the book. She spent 28 years working alongside Louis Kahn. She was among the first female graduates of Harvard University, studying under Walter Gropius and Marcel Breuer. Her 1975 PhD was titled Simultaneous Randomness and Order, the Fibonacci Divine Proportion as a Universal Forming Principle. And this resulted in a number of architectural projects that explored numerical themes. She was the first woman to receive a Graham Foundation grant in 1965, and she designed the Trenton Bath House, which is a kind of extraordinary building, with Louis Kahn, and also explored more propositional structures in her own work, including the City Tower, which was designed as a sort of structural reaction against nature. Ting's model for the City Tower was exhibited at the Visionary Architecture Exhibition at MoMA in New York in 1960, and it became known as a revolutionary expansion of the tetrahedral lattice. The avant-garde group Archigram would later adopt the tetrahedral lattice as the foundation of its 1964 plug-in city. The book doesn't just focus on women whose practices were indelibly linked to a man's, but does draw attention to a number of architects globally who worked in the post-war period independently under their own name, such as Flora Rouchat-Roncati, who in 1988 designed the Trans-Jurane Highway, linking the Swiss and French road network through the Jura Mountains, and Minette de Silva, a pioneer of Sri Lankan modernism, whose buildings fused artisanal traditions with new construction techniques, and she really seems to be experiencing a kind of more recent rediscovery. But an architect that I'm going to speak in a little bit more detail about is a Polish one. Jadwiga Grabowska-Hawrylak is probably the best known Polish woman architect, or at least kind of best known outside of Poland. She only recently passed away in 2018, living long enough to see a full retrospective of her work, which was shown in an exhibition called Patchwork in New York. Jadwiga was born in 1920. She studied architecture in Wrocław, and she was the first woman to obtain a diploma at the Faculty of Architecture in 1950. Unusually for a woman at the time in Poland, and really anywhere else in the world, Jadwiga designed under her name and without a male counterpart. She was a key participant in building Wrocław after it was severely destroyed in the Second World War. Her postmodern aesthetic is said to be a reflection of the kind of changing politics and culture of Poland. And so some of her early designs, including the Scientist House, shown here on the right, was really one of the kind of first modernist high-rise buildings built in Wrocław after World War II, before blocks of flats became kind of really commonplace. It was built to house scientists working at the Wrocław Polytechnic. It was built on plaque Gromowski, which had been raised in 1945. And that is where, you know, one of her more famed buildings that I will kind of show you in a bit is also built. Jadwiga designed these buildings in partnership with others, not least other kind of quite well-known Polish women architects. During her professional career, she worked at the Wrocław University of Technology from 1947 in the Arcady Cooperative between 1948 and 1951, and then later at the Design and Research Office of General Construction, which was one of the largest architecture firms in the city. And her first work was actually historic reconstruction of kind of houses around the city's market square, which they're really quite a contrast from the most striking project that she did and the one that is featured in Breaking Ground, Grondwolski Square Housing Complex, which she completed in Wrocław in 1973. The city's construction was not an early post-war priority because of the large focus on rebuilding Warsaw. War-damaged buildings in Wrocław, as with many other cities in Poland, provided raw materials for Warsaw's reconstruction. So work in Wrocław did not really start seriously until kind of 1952. The building is made from prefabricated concrete volumes with curved patios. And this was a time when prefabricated housing was producing quite like innocuous, boring schemes, lacking in personality. And so Gromowski Square, in contrast, is highly experimental. The most common photographic views don't really make clear how the structure fits together. A series of 6 towers arranged along a kind of pedestal with smaller commercial buildings filling in the gaps. And construction was actually stopped by the government in 1972, supposedly because of its avant-garde experience. The development is commonly referred to as Manhattan in Wrocław and elsewhere, but it was actually originally designed to be white in the style of a sort of maybe more acceptable Le Corbusian modernism, which Jadwiga admired. This never happened, and as a result it has been kind of associated with brutalism, although it has been recently repainted and kind of restored to her original wishes. Surprisingly, Jadwiga also intended the building to be covered in plants, but I haven't really found any kind of indicative images of that. She said of the building, "I had to find some way for prefabricated elements to create a non-trivial original form. Since we can't yet afford modelling each individual residential building, let's try to arrange sculptural compositions from ready-made mass duplicate elements. Concrete can be an excellent material for sculpture." And so you can see here the buildings are painted white. This photo was taken very recently. This is in fact my dad, who is the first architectural tourist from Breaking Ground. He was in Poland and he'd seen the buildings in the book and wanted to visit them and sort them out. So, you know, it was this project that led to her becoming the first woman to be awarded the most prestigious architecture prize in Poland, the honorary award from the Association of Polish Architects in 1974. And another of her key works is the Millennium Memorial Church of the Wrocław Diocese, which features a large gabled brick structure topped with a minimal angular frame. It was actually completed in 1990, which is 9 years after Jadwiga had retired from practice. So, you know, she really kind of kept going. But she did, however, move into quilts and quilt making, hence the name of her retrospective patchwork. And she really felt it was important to kind of weave those into that exhibition and show her architecture work alongside her kind of later craft-based work. 2 of her children and 4 of her grandchildren later became architects. The 2 other Polish women who featured in Breaking Ground, Barbara Brukowska and Sophia Hansen. Brukowska was a member of the avant-garde Praisens group before World War II. The group, heavily influenced by Le Corbusier, championed functional housing for the masses that could be built cheaply. Brukowska advocated practical furnishings and equipment, and she spent several years designing the interiors of passenger ships. She was the first woman to be appointed professor at Warsaw University of Technology. The first avant-garde project in Poland was her home of her partner, which was also an architecture studio in Warsaw. And the concept was really framed as a counterpoint to the Dutch neoplasticism of the Die Stijl. The interior of the house was inspired by Le Corbusier's La Roche Villa, and critics called it the most trademark example of modernist architecture in Poland. It was awarded a bronze medal at the International Exhibition of Art and Technology in Contemporary Life in Paris in 1937. And Brukowska, she was also a really talented furniture designer, creating a number of pieces, including the Polish version of the sort of famous Frankfurt kitchen. Sophia Hansen graduated from the Faculty of Architecture at Warsaw University of Technology, and she was a co-creator with her husband Oskar Hansen of open form theory, which has become a kind of important school of thought within Polish architecture. According to open form, architecture should be created with the end user in mind, rather than, as Hansen had interpreted modernism, a closed art form in which the user kind of had no choice and was entirely guided. The 2 participated in a number of post-war meetings of CIAM, presenting their proposal for the extension of the Sacheta Art Gallery at the Otlu meeting in 1959. The project is essentially a kind of cubic volume which is connected to the ground through these 4 corner pillars, which you can see in this model, hosting technical spaces and just kind of secondary stairs. The entrance stair is located in the center, which leaves this kind of ground floor completely open. The main volume is enveloped by this sort of 3-dimensional metal grid, which generates a double facade, and the technical systems are exposed in this space between the interior volume and the one defined by the grid. It's made up of these sort of identical square elements, which can then lift up, and so the whole kind of thing becomes a sort of continuously variable series of openings. Both the plans and these sort of elevations are explorations of neutral surfaces, which could then be varied through time and be adopted and used and inhabited and adapt to changing uses and conditions. And so the architecture is kind of an infrastructure that really highlights human activity, which will be happening in the interior space. The scheme really demonstrates their interest in buildings that would programmatically evolve. And in the case of the Sacheta Art Gallery extension, that is really embodied by how movable everything is. And it's often cited as a result as a reference for Cedric Price's slightly later but yet better known 1963 project, the Von Palace. Many of Sophia Hansen's projects transcend the theoretical. She built a number of large-scale buildings, but it's their private house, built in 1968, which embodies the concept of open form most clearly. And apologies, I just could not find a better image of this house. We'll have to make do. So the first move of the house was to build just a wall on site, just seen as this kind of simple gesture. But actually within the interior, the whole building feels like there are no walls at all. It really opens up to the garden. They try to really minimize their roles as architects. It's really kind of given over and shaped around occupation and use. There was no explicit design beforehand. The design evolved entirely as the building was built. Oskar and Sophia's other work includes a number of large-scale housing estates in Poland. However, they were really dissatisfied with the fact that residents could not choose their own apartments in the end, and therefore fit them to their own needs. And this led the couple to state that they wish they had backed out of the project at the start. So they were, really idealists. What is really notable about the couple is that while Sophia is widely credited alongside Oskar for the couple's work in more explanatory bits of texts, books, articles, the author tends to always revert to talking solely about Oskar Hansen, and he is therefore kind of explicitly credited with the ideas of open form, but also the kind of resultant architecture. So Sophia has been, essentially written out of their work. There's a firm divide between works in the book that are viewed through this sort of historical lens versus those produced in a more contemporary context, such as this project. While Breaking Ground attempts to make visible a small corrective to architectural history, it's really also trying to showcase buildings that reflect changing architectural styles over the last kind of 120 years, and therefore tries to really capture what's happening in the 21st century. As the building industry and structures of practice have changed, so has the architecture. So a diverse number of projects in the book cover a wide range of geographies, communicating the work of some well-established architects, but also capturing a younger generation who are developing new architectural languages and building practices. Younger in this context is relative. Architecture does take time. So this building was designed by founder and director of Atelier Masumi in Nigeria, who's Mariam Kamara. Mariam was in fact a software designer before becoming an architect, and she speaks regularly about creating an architecture that is reflective of the region in which it exists, seeking to engage the public in the production of buildings. Alina Jamil Architects is based in Selangor, Malaysia, and their project Bamboo Playhouse explores the use of bamboo in contemporary buildings, which is apparently rare in Malaysia, surprisingly. So she's really proposing its modern use as a sustainable building material. Sandra Barkley studied architecture in Lima, Peru, and Paris before founding the architecture practice Barkley Cruz, and with Jean-Pierre Cruz in 1994. Originally based in Paris, the office moved to Lima in 2006, and the studio's work explores the bonds between landscape, climate, and architecture. Barkley contributed to the Peruvian entry of the Venice Architecture Biennale in 2012 and curated Peru's Pavilion in 2016. In 2018, she was the winner of Architect of the Year Prize for Women in Architecture. So it feels really important to emphasize there are inherent challenges in compiling what can sometimes be perceived as a totalizing list, which focus only on the autonomy of the built object and taps into a singular history of building in the past 100 years. In this sense, the book can only ever provide a limited framework to open up a subjective conversation about what architecture is and how it is made. Yet representation is important, as has been pointed out, that despite breaking ground, including a wide range of works, from a global perspective, it features only 2 Black female architects. Equally, a number of celebrated architects in the US have expressed their concern that not enough significant American women are represented, which was a surprise to me, seeing as there's a large number. And so this kind of increased recent focus on women architects has become understood as a means to deliver recognition and accolade, rather than the kind of intention as author, which is to really talk about solidarity with a project of re-emerging feminist action. Negotiating the effective politics of books such as this means that they can no longer simply aim at being exclusionary. They must go deeper beyond this pluralistic understanding of diversity. And so taking into account the subjective lens, it was actually really hard to just simply include everyone we wanted to. But this is also because over and over again, only the founding partner or named director of a practice seemed eligible for recognition, whilst those who have contributed significantly to a firm whose history spans generations are more likely to be lost in the mechanisms that govern it at scale. Such as people like Natalie de Blois of SOM, or Nicola Rutt, who is featured in the book as well, from Hawkins Brown, and Ellen Van Loon from OMA. When you have 3 women from 150 who work for someone else's practice, despite that being the kind of more normal condition, most people work for someone else and not for themselves. So as the research progressed, we became increasingly preoccupied with challenging how the profession recognises authorship, to highlight that architectural production demands attributes that balance creative expression with business acumen. This talk has focused explicitly on the contribution of women to built works, and it's not even alluded to the numerous other ways in which women have been involved in contingent forms of architecture practice, including art, planning, theory, teaching, and alternative forms of design without the capital A. The flexibility of non-studio-based working environments and barriers to access in the building industry have meant that women, kind of out of necessity, have been heavily influential in shaping theoretical discourse rather than construction. Jane Jacobs, one of the most influential American writers of the 20th century, who promoted street life around her Greenwich Village home in Manhattan, advocated a form of architecture preoccupied with everyday and participatory approaches to design. Her writing on urbanism is widely read and globally disseminated to this day. And so in an age when New York public official Robert Moses was single-handedly reshaping the city with bold infrastructural gestures, Jacobs' view was a refreshing antidote based on kind of the observations of the way in which people actually lived. So in order to capture the importance of those such as Jacobs, breaking ground includes a reading list and notes that describe the work of others who have contributed to architectural discourse in what can be thought of as perhaps quieter, but equally influential ways. And so this aims at demonstrating yet another way in which we could begin to start acknowledging women's work, and work towards creating a professional body that is really as diverse as the people architects design for. I want to end by focusing on a number of exciting new groups that are doing just that and who have recently been established, literally, in the last 2 years, to counter the invisibility of women in practice and advocate for the recognition of diversity within the profession. Women Design at Harvard University were unsuccessful in their 2013 campaign to have Denise Scott Brown retroactively awarded the Pritzker, but they demonstrated that mainstream inclusion is a political necessity, and they continue to organise events focused on gender equity both in and outside Harvard's Graduate School of Design. Architetti in Rome created a publication of 365 biographies of women architects working all over the world, which coincided with the Venice Architecture Biennale in 2018 to oppose the repeating of all male scenarios. So that was really in reaction to curator of that Biennale, the Chilean architect Alejandro Aravena, who on opening the Biennale hosted a panel of 11 people, all of whom were men, even though the theme was about overcoming obstacles in architecture. And so Architetti they have this new campaign. They have a new website where you can click on different countries in the world and it lists significant women practitioners there. So no excuse for not knowing who's out there or inviting women to events and panels and teaching and designing. Catherine Williams' website, Black Women in Architecture in the US, launched literally just before Christmas 2019. And there's Women in Architecture in the UK, the High Vis Collective also in the UK. And so these are just a handful of groups. I could name many more: Part W, Mujer Architectas, Black Females in Architecture, Matri Architecture in South Africa, like groups all over the world. And they've, what's really interesting is they've all formed in the last year or two. And their projects are really traversing kind of the theoretical and activist registers to locate new forms of architectural work largely outside the academy and outside mainstream publications such as Breaking Ground, you know, those kind of institutions that formally represent the profession. And so what, you know, we're kind of really hoping with this kind of work is that this thinking can become joined up, and that the work of women can become not only more visible, as it has been historically overlooked, but that women's work can be valued in contemporary practice. So I hope that's kind of been of some interest, and that you'll be interested in getting a copy of the book and looking at the work of kind of other women architects globally. Thanks for joining me. Bye.